a commanding voice that silenced an entire luxury auction house, a young farmer's daughter facing unprecedented humiliation among Manhattan's elite, a grandfather's shocking appearance that would not only reveal a hidden industrial empire but expose a secret legacy that would transform struggling Midwestern farms into pioneering agricultural cooperatives, and the remarkable revelation of how one family's quiet power had been safeguarding America's heartland for generations, all triggered by one bidder's cruel attempt to shame a woman in overalls who dared to enter their wealthy domain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Auction House cast harsh light on Madison Hayes' worn leather boots as she hesitated at the entrance to New York's most exclusive estate auction. At 27, the agricultural science graduate had traveled from Clearwater County, Iowa, with exactly one purpose: to purchase the vintage 1923 John Deere prototype featured in the auction catalog. The piece held profound personal significance for reasons she couldn't fully disclose, but she carried her carefully saved $15,000 in certified funds, believing it would be enough for what was listed as a decorative agricultural artifact. "Well, would you look at what wandered in from the cornfields?" A sharp voice cut through the refined murmurs of the gathering crowd. Madison turned to find Veronica Sterling, an art dealer she'd unfortunately encountered at the preview event, surrounded by a cluster of similarly dressed socialites in designer suits that likely cost more than Madison's annual salary. "Perhaps she's looking for the farmer's market," another woman suggested, her diamonds catching the light as she gestured dismissively at Madison's practical attire: clean denim, a pressed flannel shirt, and the boots that had belonged to her father. Madison straightened her shoulders, clutching the auction paddle she'd registered for earlier. "I'm here for lot 47, she stated simply, referring to the tractor prototype that had inexplicably appeared in this estate sale of industrial baron Malcolm Whitmore's extensive collection. "Lot 47? Veronica's laugh rang out like breaking glass. "Dear, that's not some rusty farm equipment. It's a piece of American industrial history. Malcolm Whitmore's personal collection doesn't go to people who track mud into auction houses." The growing cluster of observers snickered as Madison felt heat rise to her cheeks. She'd known her practical attire would stand out among Manhattan's elite, but she hadn't anticipated such open hostility. The auctioneer, a distinguished man named Harrison Bradley, who'd been presiding over high society sales for 30 years, glanced toward the commotion with barely concealed disdain. "Perhaps I should call security," he suggested loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "We do have dress code standards at Whitmore events." "That won't be necessary," Madison replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm a registered bidder." Harrison Bradley's eyebrows rose skeptically as he consulted his list. "Ah, yes, Madison Hayes from Iowa." He pronounced her home state as if it were a foreign concept. "Well, I suppose we must honor all registrations, though I doubt you'll find anything within your range." As the auction commenced, Madison endured 2 hours of subtle and not-so-subtle jabs whenever she dared to raise her paddle for smaller lots. Each time, wealthy bidders would dramatically outbid her while exchanging amused glances. The atmosphere grew increasingly hostile as it became clear she wouldn't be intimidated into leaving. Finally, Lot 47 approached. The pristine 1923 John Deere prototype was wheeled onto the platform, its green paint gleaming under the lights. Madison's heart raced as she recognized specific modifications that confirmed her suspicions about its true significance. Lot 47, Harrison Bradley announced with theatrical flair. A rare 1923 John Deere experimental prototype from the Whitmore Industrial Collection, one of only 3 ever manufactured, featuring innovative hydraulic systems that revolutionized agricultural equipment. Will start the bidding at $50,000. Madison felt her stomach drop. The catalog had listed an estimate of $10,000, $15,000. The sudden inflation was clearly meant to exclude her from participating. $50,000, called a voice from the back, belonging to a tech billionaire known for collecting vintage machinery. $75,000, countered another bidder, a museum representative Madison recognized from her research. She gripped her paddle tighter, knowing her $15,000 was now meaningless. The bidding quickly escalated to $150,000, with Veronica Sterling joining in, seemingly just for the pleasure of watching Madison's growing distress. $200,000, Veronica declared, turning to lock eyes with Madison. Some of us actually appreciate industrial heritage. Harrison Bradley smiled approvingly. The bid stands at $200,000. Do I hear $250,000? Madison's voice carried across the suddenly silent room. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Laughter erupted from multiple directions as Harrison Bradley's face contorted with a mixture of amusement and irritation. "Young lady," he said with exaggerated patience, "this is a serious auction. We require proof of funds for bids exceeding—" "She probably thinks we accept payment in corn bushels," Veronica interjected, earning another round of laughter. Madison stood her ground despite the burning humiliation. "I said $250,000. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." "This is ridiculous," Harrison Bradley declared. "Security, please escort this young woman. Let her bid." The voice that cut through the chaos was quiet yet carried such authority that the entire room fell instantly silent. All heads turned toward the entrance where an elderly man stood, his presence commanding despite his simple appearance. He wore a well-maintained but clearly vintage suit, his silver hair neatly combed, and his posture military straight despite his apparent age. But it was his eyes, sharp, intelligent, and currently filled with controlled anger, that held everyone's attention. Harrison Bradley's face underwent a remarkable transformation as recognition dawned. The blood drained from his complexion as he gripped the podium for support. Mr. Whitmore." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Phones appeared as attendees began frantically searching for images of the reclusive industrial magnate who had supposedly died 15 years ago. "James Whitmore," the man confirmed, walking forward with measured steps. "And that young woman you're attempting to humiliate is my granddaughter." The silence that followed was absolute. Veronica Sterling's designer clutch slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a sharp crack. Several attendees who'd been recording Madison's humiliation quickly lowered their phones. "Grandfather," Madison whispered, her own shock genuine despite knowing he was alive. She hadn't expected him to appear publicly after maintaining his carefully crafted disappearance for so long. James Whitmore reached Madison's side and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. At 85, he still radiated the power that had built one of America's most successful industrial empires before his strategic death and retreat from public life. "Harrison," he addressed the auctioneer with deadly calm, "I believe you were in the process of accepting my granddaughter's bid. Please continue." Harrison Bradley's hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. The bid stands at $250,000. Do I hear any advances?" The room remained frozen. No one dared bid against James Whitmore's granddaughter, especially after witnessing his emergence from years of self-imposed exile. "Sold," Harrison Bradley's voice cracked, "to Ms. Hayes for $250,000. As the gavel fell, James Whitmore turned to address the room, his voice carrying easily without need for amplification. 15 years ago, I chose to step away from public life after witnessing how wealth and power had corrupted the very industries I helped build. I've watched from the shadows as people like you," his gaze swept across the assembled elite, "forgot that every great fortune in this country was built on the backs of farmers, laborers, and innovators who actually created value." He gestured toward the John Deere prototype. That machine represents more than industrial heritage. It represents the moment American agriculture began its transformation. And the modifications you see, they were designed by my father, William Whitmore, who started as a farm equipment mechanic before building the empire you all revere. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as James continued. "I've spent the last 15 years quietly redistributing my wealth to support the very communities you mock. Madison isn't just my granddaughter. She's one of the brightest agricultural scientists of her generation, working to revolutionize sustainable farming practices." He turned to face Veronica Sterling directly. "While you collect art and ridicule those who actually work the land, she's developing drought-resistant crop variants that will feed millions. So tell me, who really appreciates heritage?" The aftermath of his speech left the room in stunned silence. Madison stood taller now. The earlier humiliation transformed into something else entirely. Vindication, certainly, but also the weight of responsibility that came with her newly revealed identity. "Grandfather," she said softly, "you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he replied firmly. "It's time they remembered where real value comes from. Now, let's claim your inheritance." As they walked toward the payment desk, whispers erupted throughout the room. Phones buzzed with frantic messages as New York's elite tried to process the resurrection of James Whitmore and the implications of his public reappearance. Harrison Bradley approached them with stammering apologies, which James dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Harrison, you've simply demonstrated why I left this world behind. No apologies necessary. You've actually done me a favor by showing Madison exactly what she's fighting against." The payment process was completed with unusual speed. The auction house staff, now treating Madison with excessive deference that felt almost as uncomfortable as their earlier disdain. As they prepared to leave, James paused at the exit and turned back to address the room once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've witnessed something important today. Not my return from supposed death, but the moment you were reminded that true worth isn't measured by designer labels or social status. It's measured by contribution to society." He glanced at Madison with unmistakable pride. "And my granddaughter has more worth in her mud-stained boots than most of you will accumulate in a lifetime of collecting pretty things." Outside the auction house, Madison finally allowed herself to breathe properly. The New York afternoon sun felt different now, less harsh and judging than when she'd arrived. "You planned this," she accused gently, studying her grandfather's satisfied expression. James smiled, the stern facade cracking to reveal the warmth she remembered from childhood visits to his secret residence in Montana. "Not exactly. I planned to bid anonymously through my lawyer, but when I saw how they were treating you..." His jaw tightened. "Some lessons need to be delivered personally." They walked to where a vintage but perfectly maintained Packard waited with a discreet driver. As they settled into the leather seats, Madison couldn't help but ask the question that had haunted her for years. "Why did you disappear, grandfather?" The official story never made sense. James was quiet for a moment, watching the Manhattan skyline pass by. "After your grandmother died, I realized I'd spent my life building an empire that had lost its original purpose. Whitmore Industries started as a way to help farmers like my father access better equipment. By the end, we were just another corporation maximizing profits at the expense of the very people we meant to serve." He turned to face her. "So I engineered my death and began redistributing wealth through anonymous foundations. For 15 years, I've been funding agricultural research, supporting small farms, and waiting for someone in the family to show they understood what really matters." "And I passed your test?" Madison asked, thinking of her years of work developing sustainable farming methods despite her family's wishes for her to join the corporate world. "You didn't even know there was a test," James chuckled. "That's what made you perfect. While your cousins fought over my supposed estate in probate court, you were in Iowa perfecting drought-resistant wheat variants. You chose substance over status without any promise of reward." The car turned onto a quieter street, heading toward a private airfield where James's plane waited. "The tractor," Madison realized suddenly. "You planted it in the auction." "Guilty," he admitted. "I needed to see how you'd handle that world, the world I left behind, whether you'd compromise your values when faced with their contempt." "I almost walked away," she confessed. "When the bidding started at $50,000, I knew I couldn't compete." "But you didn't walk away," James pointed out. "You stood your ground even when it seemed hopeless. That's what I needed to know." As they boarded the private jet that would take them to Montana, James revealed the true scope of what Madison had inherited. Not just wealth, but a carefully constructed network of agricultural innovation centers, research facilities, and a foundation with billions in assets dedicated to transforming American farming. The Whitmore fortune wasn't built on industrial excellence alone, he explained as they flew over the heartland. It was built on understanding that feeding people is the most honorable business in the world. Somewhere along the way, that got lost in board meetings and profit margins. The pilot announced their approach to the private airstrip near James's Montana ranch. As they descended, Madison could see vast experimental fields laid out in precise grids, the secret testing grounds for agricultural innovations that had revolutionized farming practices over the past decade. "All of this has been operating anonymously?" Madison asked, struggling to comprehend the scale of what she was seeing. "Through various trusts and foundations," James confirmed, "but anonymity has its limits. It's time for the Whitmore name to stand for something again, publicly this time." As they landed, Madison noticed a delegation waiting on the tarmac. Scientists she recognized from agricultural conferences, engineers she'd corresponded with about equipment innovations, and Policymakers she'd only seen on television. They all, apparently, had been part of her grandfather's secret network. "Madison," James said formally as they deplaned, "I'd like you to meet the real board of directors of Whitmore Agricultural Solutions. They've been waiting to meet their new CEO." The shock must have shown on her face because several people smiled warmly. Dr. Elena Martinez, a renowned botanist Madison had idolized since graduate school, stepped forward. "Your research on drought-resistant crops caught our attention 3 years ago," she explained. "We've been funding your work indirectly, waiting for James to decide if you were ready for the full truth." The incident at the auction today, added Thomas Chen, an engineer whose revolutionary irrigation systems had transformed water conservation, was actually the final test. Though I don't think any of us expected James to break cover so dramatically. Over the next several hours, Madison learned the true extent of her grandfather's operation. The death had allowed him to liquidate public holdings and restructure everything toward a singular mission, ensuring global food security through technological innovation while supporting small-scale farmers against corporate agriculture monopolies. "We've developed technologies that could transform farming worldwide," James explained as they toured the facility. "But releasing them through traditional corporate channels would have meant patent restrictions, profit-driven distribution, and, ultimately, the same inequality I was trying to fight. Instead, they'd created an open-source model, sharing innovations freely while using the Whitmore fortune to fund implementation in developing regions. The results were staggering. Crop yields had increased dramatically in test regions, water usage had decreased, and small farmers were thriving instead of being forced to sell to large corporations. "Why me?" Madison finally asked, as they stood overlooking a field where robotic systems tended experimental crops. "Why not just tell me years ago?" James smiled thoughtfully. "Because I needed to know you'd choose this path without incentive. Anyone can claim noble intentions when billions are at stake, but you chose to help farmers when you thought you had nothing to gain. That's the difference between inheriting wealth and earning responsibility." As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the experimental fields in golden light, Madison felt the weight of her new role settling onto her shoulders. The humiliation at the auction seemed distant now, transformed into something else. Entirely, a catalyst that had revealed not just her grandfather's survival, but her own destiny. "Tomorrow," James announced, "we hold a press conference. The world needs to know that Whitmore Industries is returning with a new mission. No more hiding in the shadows." Madison nodded, thinking of Veronica Sterling and the others who had mocked her boots and farming background. They'd soon learn that true power often wore overalls instead of designer suits, and that the greatest inheritance wasn't money or status, but purpose. The vintage John Deere prototype would be shipped to Montana where it belonged, not as a collectible gathering dust in some billionaire's gallery, but as a working symbol of where they came from and where they were going. It would be restored to full functionality and used to test new, sustainable farming techniques, bridging past innovation with future necessity. That night, as Madison settled into her room at the ranch, she found herself thinking about the day's events with a mixture of disbelief and determination. Her grandfather had orchestrated not just a dramatic reveal, but a profound lesson about value, worth, and the responsibility that came with privilege. The next morning would bring a media storm as news of James Whitmore's return from the dead spread across financial networks. But more importantly, it would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the Whitmore legacy, one where profit served purpose, where innovation benefited those who needed it most, and where a farmer's daughter in worn boots would lead one of America's most powerful agricultural dynasties into a new era of responsibility and reform. As she drifted off to sleep, Madison could hear the distant sound of night irrigation systems watering experimental crops. The same determination that had kept her standing tall in that auction house now fueled her vision for the future. The elite who had mocked her would soon learn that the revolution in American agriculture wouldn't come from boardrooms or society galas, but from the very fields they dismissed as beneath them. The humiliation at the Whitmore Auction House had been transformed into something far more powerful, the spark that ignited a movement that would change the face of farming forever. And at its center stood Madison Hayes, no longer just a farmer's daughter from Iowa, but the inheritor of a legacy that would prove true worth, had nothing to do with social status and everything to do with serving humanity's most fundamental need, the cultivation of food and the preservation of those who grew it. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Montana Ranch's conference room as Madison Hayes faced her first major decision as CEO of Whitmore. Agricultural Solutions. The press conference scheduled for noon would not only announce James Whitmore's return from supposed death, but also unveil the true scope of their agricultural revolution. Around the polished wooden table sat the core team of scientists, engineers, and policy advisors who had operated in secrecy for 15 years. The media response to yesterday's auction incident has been explosive, reported Sarah Chen, head of communications, sliding tablets around the table displaying social media metrics. Every major network wants exclusive interviews. The footage of James confronting the auction house has gone viral, over 10 million views in 12 hours. Madison studied the headlines ranging from "Dead Billionaire Returns" to "Shame Manhattan Elite" to "Whitmore Heiress Humiliated at Auction," the full story. What struck her most was how the narrative focused on the drama rather than the underlying message about agricultural innovation and social responsibility. "We need to shift this conversation," Madison declared, surprising herself with the authority in her voice. "This isn't about revenge or social drama. It's about transforming how the world approaches food security." Dr. Elena Martinez nodded approvingly. "Exactly what we've been waiting to hear. James always said you'd understand the bigger picture." James Whitmore, who had been quietly observing from his position at the head of the table, leaned forward. "Madison's right. The auction incident was merely a catalyst. Now we have the world's attention. Let's use it wisely." Thomas Chen activated a holographic display showing global agricultural data. "Our shadow operations have already impacted food production in 17 countries. We've increased crop yields by an average of 60% while reducing water usage by 40%. But these were all pilot programs, limited by our need for secrecy. The drought-resistant wheat variants you developed, Madison," added Dr. Martinez, "have been tested in sub-Saharan Africa with remarkable results. We're ready for large-scale implementation." Madison absorbed the information, her mind racing with possibilities. "What's been holding us back from full deployment?" "Corporate interference," James answered bluntly. "The moment we reveal our innovations, every agricultural giant will try to either buy us out or bury us in litigation. That's why we need to move fast and bold. The strategy session continued through the morning, with Madison gradually taking more control of the discussion. Her years of fieldwork combined with her academic training provided unique insights that even surprised the veteran team members. Instead of a traditional corporate announcement, Madison suggested, what if we frame this as a global initiative? Position ourselves not as a company returning to market, but as a movement dedicated to ending food insecurity. Sarah Chen's eyes lit up. A manifesto rather than a press release. Brilliant. By 11:30, they had crafted a comprehensive plan. The press conference would be held in the experimental fields rather than a sterile conference room. They would demonstrate working prototypes of their innovations and announce immediate partnerships with small farmer cooperatives worldwide. As Madison changed into professional attire for the conference, notably keeping her father's leather boots as a deliberate choice, she found her grandfather waiting in the hallway. "Nervous?" he asked, adjusting her collar with paternal care. "Terrified," she admitted. "Yesterday I was just a researcher from Iowa. Today I'm supposed to lead a revolution." James smiled. "You've been leading it for years, Madison. You just didn't know you had an army behind you." The press conference drew over 200 journalists from around the world, their satellite trucks and equipment creating a surreal contrast against the Montana landscape. Madison stood at a podium set up at the edge of an experimental field where autonomous farming robots tended crops with precision unmatched by human hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the cameras. "Yesterday, many of you witnessed what appeared to be a social drama at a Manhattan auction house. Today, I'm here to tell you what it really was, the end of an era of agricultural elitism and the beginning of a new age of farming democracy." She gestured to the fields behind her. For 15 years, Whitmore Agricultural Solutions has operated in secrecy, developing technologies that could revolutionize global food production. We've remained hidden, not out of corporate paranoia, but because the agricultural establishment has consistently prioritized profits over people. The journalists murmured as Madison outlined their achievements. Drought-resistant crops that could thrive in previously unfarmable regions. AI-driven pest management systems that eliminated the need for harmful pesticides and microfinancing. Programs that had saved thousands of small farms from corporate takeover. My grandfather, James Whitmore, didn't fake his death to avoid taxes or escape justice, she continued. He did it to create a parallel system that could develop solutions without interference from those who profit from scarcity. James stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. 15 years ago, I realized my own company had become part of the problem. We were patenting seeds that farmers had cultivated for generations, creating dependencies that enriched shareholders while impoverishing communities. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. So I dismantled everything and started over. Every innovation you see here is open source. Every technology is available to any farmer who needs it, because food security isn't a business opportunity, it's a human right. The announcement sent shockwaves through the agricultural industry. Within hours, stock prices for major agribusiness corporations began to plummet as investors realized the implications of Whitmore's open-source revolution. Small farmer associations worldwide issued statements of support, while corporate lobbyists scrambled to respond. In the days following the press conference, Madison found herself at the center of a media storm, unlike anything she could have imagined. Every major network requested interviews. Agricultural journals sought exclusive access to their research, and world leaders began reaching out to discuss potential partnerships. But it was an unexpected visitor on the fourth day who brought the most significant development. Madison was reviewing implementation plans in her new office when Sarah Chen announced that Victoria Blackwood, CEO of Meridian Agricorp, the world's largest agricultural conglomerate, had arrived demanding a meeting. Victoria Blackwood embodied everything Madison had come to oppose: designer suit, calculating eyes, and an aura of corporate ruthlessness that had earned her the nickname the Harvester in business circles. She swept into the office without waiting for permission, followed by a team of lawyers. "Ms. Hayes," Victoria began without preamble, "your grandfather's little stunt has cost my shareholders billions. I'm here to discuss terms." Madison remained seated, refusing to be intimidated. "We're not for sale, Ms. Blackwood." Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Everything is for sale. The only question is price." She placed a document on Madison's desk. "Meridian is prepared to offer $50 billion for Whitmore Agricultural Solutions. That's more than your grandfather's entire fortune at its peak." "You're missing the point," Madison replied calmly. "This isn't about money." "Then you're more naive than I thought." Victoria's facade cracked slightly, revealing genuine frustration. "Do you understand what you're doing? You're destabilizing an entire industry. Millions of jobs depend on the current system. Millions of lives depend on affordable food," Madison countered. "Which would you prioritize?" The meeting grew increasingly tense as Victoria alternated between offers and threats. Finally, she played what she clearly believed was her trump card. "I knew your father," Victoria said suddenly. "Did you know that?" Madison stiffened. Her father, Robert Hayes, had died when she was in college, leaving behind the small family farm that had inspired her career path. "He came to Meridian for help when the drought hit," Victoria continued. "We offered to buy his land at a fair price. He refused, said something about family legacy." She paused for effect. "He died bankrupt, Madison. Is that the legacy you want to protect?" The revelation hit Madison like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure. "My father died protecting what he believed in. That's exactly the legacy I intend to honor." Victoria gathered her documents, her expression hardening. "You have no idea what forces you're up against. Meridian and our partners won't allow you to destroy everything we've built." "We're not destroying anything," Madison replied. "We're building something better." After Victoria left, Madison sat in silence, processing the encounter. Her grandfather found her there an hour later, staring out at the experimental fields. "She tried to buy us out?" James asked, though it wasn't really a question. "And threatened us when I refused." Madison turned to face him. She knew Dad, said he came to them for help before. James nodded sadly. "Robert was proud like you. He'd rather lose everything than compromise his principles." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Victoria Blackwood represents everything wrong with modern agriculture. She'll fight us with every resource at her disposal. Let her." Meridian AgriCorp and its allies launched a multi-front assault. Legal challenges to Whitmore's patents, lobbying efforts to restrict open-source agricultural technology, and a media campaign painting Madison as a dangerous, radical, threatening agricultural stability. But for every corporate attack, grassroots support grew stronger. Farmers' associations worldwide began implementing Whitmore technologies, sharing success stories that no amount of corporate PR could suppress. Environmental groups celebrated the reduction in pesticide use, while development organizations praised the potential for addressing global hunger. The turning point came 6 weeks after the press conference, during Madison's testimony before the Senate Agriculture Committee. The hearing, ostensibly about agricultural innovation and food security, had clearly been orchestrated by Meridian's lobbyists to discredit the Whitmore initiative. Senator Charles Hammond, chair of the committee, a known ally of corporate agriculture, led the questioning with barely concealed hostility. "Ms. Hayes," he began, "your organization claims to offer these technologies freely. How do you expect to sustain such operations without profit?" Madison had anticipated this line of questioning. "Senator, the Whitmore Foundation has an endowment of $30 billion thanks to my grandfather's foresight. We're not a charity, we're a catalyst. Our goal is to prove that sustainable, equitable agriculture is not only possible, but profitable for individual farmers." "But doesn't your open-source model undermine American agricultural competitiveness?" "On the contrary," Madison replied, "it enhances it. When farmers aren't burdened by licensing fees and technology restrictions, they can innovate and adapt to local conditions. We're not giving away American technology. We're democratizing innovation itself." The hearing continued for hours, with Madison calmly deflecting every attack while presenting data that even the most skeptical senators couldn't ignore. When Senator Hammond attempted to question her qualifications, she responded with detailed, technical explanations that demonstrated expertise beyond her years. The most dramatic moment came when Hammond introduced a surprise witness, Dr. Richard Stanton, a former Whitmore researcher who claimed the organization's technologies were unsafe and untested. "I worked with James Whitmore for 7 years, Stanton testified. "His obsession with open-source distribution ignores critical safety protocols. These technologies need years of additional testing before public release." Madison listened carefully, recognizing the coordinated attack. When given the opportunity to respond, she revealed something that shocked the entire room. "Dr. Stanton, isn't it true that you left Whitmore Agricultural Solutions in 2019 to become Senior Vice President of Research at Meridian AgriCorp?" She produced employment records that Sarah Chen had uncovered. "And isn't it also true that your division at Meridian has been trying to replicate our drought-resistant crop variants for the past 3 years without success?" Stanton's face reddened as Madison continued. "Every technology we've released has undergone rigorous testing in multiple environments. We have safety data from 17 countries, verified by independent laboratories." She turned to address the committee directly. What Dr. Stanton calls unsafe is simply unprofitable for his current employer. The revelation of Stanton's conflict of interest undermined the opposition's entire narrative. Senator Hammond, visibly flustered, attempted to regain control of the hearing, but found himself facing questions from his own committee members about corporate influence on agricultural policy. That evening, footage of Madison's testimony dominated news cycles. Social media exploded with support for the farmer's daughter who took down Big Ag. The hashtag Hayes for Humanity trended globally as people shared stories of how corporate agriculture had impacted their communities. James watched the coverage with quiet satisfaction from his study at the ranch. When Madison joined him after returning from Washington, he raised a glass of whiskey in tribute. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he said softly. "She always believed that truth, properly presented, was the most powerful weapon against injustice." "We're winning the public relations battle," Madison acknowledged, "but Victoria won't stop. She can't afford to." "No, she can't," James agreed, "which is why we need to accelerate our timeline. How soon can we begin full implementation of the drought-resistant crops in Africa?" Madison consulted her tablet. "Dr. Martinez says we could start distribution within 3 months, but that would require significant logistical support." "Then let's provide it." James leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with strategic intensity. "Victoria Blackwood thinks in quarters and profit margins. We're going to think in generations and human lives." The next morning, Madison convened an emergency board meeting. The team gathered in the conference room, energized by their recent victory, but aware that larger challenges lay ahead. "Meridian will escalate," Thomas Chen warned. "They have resources we can't match." "They have money," Madison corrected. "We have momentum, and something far more valuable, the moral high ground." Dr. Martinez presented a detailed implementation plan for rapid deployment of their technologies across vulnerable regions. "If we move quickly, we can establish facts on the ground before corporate interests can interfere. Once farmers see the results, no amount of lobbying will convince them to return to the old system." Sarah Chen added crucial insight from her media analysis. "Public opinion has shifted dramatically in our favor. Meridian's stock has dropped 30% since the Senate hearing. Their board is pressuring Victoria to find a solution that doesn't involve direct confrontation." "Then we offer them one," Madison decided, "but on our terms." She spent the next several days crafting a proposal that would transform the agricultural industry. Instead of treating Meridian as an enemy to be destroyed, she envisioned a new paradigm where even corporate giants could participate in the revolution, if they were willing to fundamentally change their approach. The plan centered on creating an agricultural innovation commons, where companies could contribute research and resources in exchange for access to the collective knowledge base. Profits would be capped, with excess revenues directed toward expanding access in developing regions. It was a radical reimagining of how agricultural technology could be developed and distributed. When Madison presented the proposal to her grandfather, he studied it for a long time before speaking. "This is either brilliant or naive," he finally said. "Possibly both." "Victoria Blackwood won't accept limits on profits," Madison acknowledged. "But her board might if the alternative is continued stock decline and public hostility." "You're offering them a lifeline," James realized, "a way to participate in the future instead of being swept aside by it." "Exactly. The question is whether they're smart enough to take it." The answer came 2 weeks later, when Victoria Blackwood requested another meeting. This time, she arrived alone, her demeanor noticeably different from their first encounter. "Your performance at the Senate hearing was impressive," Victoria admitted as she took a seat across from Madison. as was your handling of the Stanton situation. Dr. Stanton made his own choices, Madison replied diplomatically. Victoria studied her for a moment. You know, I actually respected your father. He was stubborn, principled to a fault. I see. Now where you get it. She paused, seeming to wrestle with her next words. The board has reviewed your proposal for the Agricultural Innovation Commons. They've authorized me to negotiate terms. Madison felt a surge of triumph, but kept her expression neutral. That's a significant shift in position. The world is changing, Victoria acknowledged. Meridian can either adapt or become irrelevant. Your grandfather understood that 15 years ago. It's taken us longer to reach the same conclusion. The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes contentious, but ultimately productive. Meridian would become the first major corporation to join the Agricultural Innovation Commons, committing significant resources while accepting the new framework of limited profits and mandatory technology sharing. The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. Other agricultural giants, seeing Meridian's pivot, began approaching Whitmore Agricultural Solutions about participation. Within months, what had started as one family's secret project had evolved into a global movement reshaping the entire agricultural sector. As Madison signed the final agreements establishing the Agricultural Innovation Commons, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The humiliation at the auction house seemed distant now, transformed from a moment of personal crisis into the catalyst for systemic change. Her grandfather joined her as she looked out over the experimental fields, now bustling with researchers from multiple organizations working together instead of competing. You've accomplished more in 3 months than I did in 15 years, James said with undisguised pride. You laid the groundwork, Madison responded. I just opened the doors. Sometimes that's the hardest part. He watched a group of international agricultural students learning about their water conservation systems. What you've created here will outlast us all. The Commons isn't just about sharing technology, it's about changing how we think about progress itself. Madison nodded, understanding the deeper truth in his words. The revolution they had started wasn't simply about better farming methods or corporate reform. It was about proving that cooperation could triumph over competition, that human needs could take precedence over profit margins, and that sometimes the most powerful innovations weren't technological at all, but social. As the sun set over the Montana ranch, painting the experimental fields in golden light, Madison felt the weight of responsibility settling more comfortably on her shoulders. The farmer's daughter who had been mocked for her muddy boots had not only inherited an agricultural empire, but had transformed it into something far greater, a movement that would ensure no one would ever have to choose between profit and principle, between feeding their family and preserving their dignity. The vintage John Deere prototype, now fully restored, stood in the lobby of the new Agricultural Innovation Commons headquarters. A plaque beside it read, "From the soil we came, to the soil we return. But in between, we have the power to nurture or exploit, to hoard or share, to compete or collaborate. Choose wisely." Madison had chosen, and in doing so, she had helped the world choose too. 3 years had passed since the establishment of the Agricultural Innovation Commons, and the transformed Whitmore estate in Montana had evolved into a global hub for agricultural revolution. The morning sun illuminated the expanded campus where, Researchers from 40 countries collaborated on projects that were reshaping food production worldwide. Madison Hayes, now 30, stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, preparing to address world leaders about the Common's remarkable achievements and its ambitious next phase. "Distinguished delegates," Madison began, her voice steady and confident. "3 years ago, we promised to democratize agricultural innovation. Today, I stand before you to report that we have not only kept that promise, but exceeded our most optimistic projections." The Assembly Hall's massive screens displayed real-time data from across the globe. Crop yields increased by 75% in previously struggling regions. Water usage reduced by 50%, and most importantly, 100 million people lifted from food insecurity through the Commons' open-source technologies. But these numbers, impressive as they are, don't tell the whole story, Madison continued. "Let me introduce you to Amara Diallo from Senegal." The screens shifted to show a proud woman standing in flourishing fields that had been barren wasteland just 2 years earlier. Through video connection, Amara addressed the assembly in French with simultaneous translation. The Commons didn't just give us seeds or technology. They gave us knowledge, dignity, and the power to feed ourselves. My village now exports food to neighboring regions. We've built schools with the profits. Our children no longer go hungry. As Amara's testimony concluded, Madison revealed the next phase of their initiative, the Global Food Security Network, an interconnected system that would predict and prevent famines before they occurred, using AI analysis of weather patterns, soil conditions, and geopolitical factors. This network, Madison explained, will be humanity's early warning system against hunger, and like everything we've developed, it will be freely available to all nations, regardless of their ability to pay. The assembly erupted in applause, with several delegates rising to their feet. But Madison noticed the empty seats in the American delegation section, a pointed reminder that not everyone celebrated their success. Back in Montana 2 days later, Madison found her grandfather in the Heritage Museum they'd created to honor agricultural pioneers. James Whitmore, now 88 but still sharp, was studying the display dedicated to his wife Margaret, whose early support of women farmers had inspired much of their current work. "The UN speech was brilliant," James said without turning. "Your grandmother would have loved how you connected individual stories to global impact." "The American delegation walked out," Madison replied, joining him at the display. "Senator, Hammond is pushing legislation to restrict our operations domestically." James chuckled. "Let him try. We've moved beyond the reach of any single government." He turned to face her, his eyes twinkling with strategic appreciation. "Which brings me to why I asked you to meet me here. It's time we discussed succession." Madison's stomach tightened. They'd avoided this conversation for 3 years, both pretending James's energy would last forever. "Grandfather, you're still sharp enough to know when to pass the torch," he interrupted gently. "But not to you." The surprise must have shown on her face, because James laughed, the full, rich sound she remembered from childhood. "You've outgrown the role of CEO, Madison. You're a global figure now. The Commons needs you as its visionary, not its administrator." He pulled out a tablet showing her a document. "I'm recommending Dr. Elena Martinez as CEO. You'll become chair of the Global Advisory Council, focusing on expansion and innovation." Madison studied the organizational chart, recognizing the wisdom in his plan. Elena had proven herself incredibly capable, and the role would free Madison to focus on what she did best, connecting with people and driving revolutionary change. "There's something else," James added, his tone becoming serious. "Victoria Blackwood has requested a private meeting. She says it's about Project Atlas." The name sent a chill down Madison's spine. Project Atlas was a rumored corporate coalition, allegedly developing proprietary technologies to compete with the commons, but with a twist. Instead of sharing innovations, they would create dependencies that locked farmers into exclusive contracts. "When?" Madison asked. "Tonight. She's flying in on her private jet." That evening, Victoria Blackwood arrived at the ranch with none of her usual entourage. The woman who entered Madison's office looked different from their last encounter. Less polished, more worn, as if the weight of recent events had finally penetrated her corporate armor. "Thank you for seeing me," Victoria began, surprising Madison with her humble tone. "I need your help." Madison gestured to a chair. "The last time we met, you threatened to destroy everything we've built. And you've destroyed everything." "I built instead," Victoria replied without bitterness. "Meridian's stock has never recovered. The board forced me out 6 months ago." "I heard. But you're here about Project Atlas." Victoria's eyes widened slightly. "You know about Atlas." "We know enough. A consortium of agricultural companies developing closed-source alternatives to our technologies, funded by private equity firms, betting against the commons' success." Victoria shook her head. "It's worse than that. Atlas isn't just about competing with you. It's about weaponizing food production." She pulled out her encrypted drive. "Everything's on here. Genetic modifications designed to create dependencies, terminator genes that prevent seed saving, AI systems that can remotely disable farming equipment if payments are missed." Madison felt her blood run cold. "Why bring this to me?" "Because I helped create it," Victoria admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "After Meridian joined the Commons, a group of hardliners approached me. They offered me a chance to lead Atlas, to prove that the old ways could still triumph." She paused, seeming to struggle with her next words. "My daughter started working with your youth programs last year. She's shown me what we're really fighting for. I can't be part of Atlas anymore." Madison studied the woman before her, searching for signs of deception. "What do you want in return?" "Redemption," Victoria answered simply. "Let me help you stop Atlas. I know their plans, their weaknesses. I can be your inside source." Next morning, Madison convened an emergency meeting of the Commons Security Council. The information on Victoria's drive was even more alarming than they'd feared. Project Atlas had secured patents on essential genetic sequences, developed legal frameworks to challenge open-source agriculture, and infiltrated regulatory bodies worldwide. "They're planning to launch in 6 months, Thomas Chen reported, analyzing the data, starting in developing nations where regulations are weaker." "Classic strategy," James observed from his position at the head of the table. "Create dependencies in vulnerable markets, then use that leverage to expand globally." Dr. Martinez, participating via hologram from Bangladesh, where she was overseeing a new research station, added crucial insight. "They're targeting the same regions where we've had the most success. They want to undermine our credibility by creating failures they can blame on our technologies." Madison felt the familiar fire of determination igniting within her. Then we need to accelerate our own timeline. How quickly can we deploy the food security network? The infrastructure is ready, Sarah Chen confirmed, but we planned for a gradual rollout to ensure stability. We don't have that luxury anymore. Madison turned to Victoria, who sat quietly at the far end of the table. What's Atlas's biggest vulnerability? Victoria straightened, seemingly grateful to contribute. Funding. They've promised investors returns within 18 months. If we can delay their launch or reduce their market impact, the whole scheme collapses. Over the next weeks, the Commons mobilized like never before. They accelerated deployment of the food security network, establishing monitoring stations in every region Atlas planned to target. Educational programs were expanded to warn farmers about the dangers of proprietary dependencies. Legal teams prepared challenges to Atlas's patents, arguing that genes essential to food production couldn't be privately owned. The conflict came to a head at the World Agricultural Summit in Berlin. Madison and the Atlas leadership, a coalition of corporate executives led by Harrison Blackstone, Victoria's replacement at Meridian, was scheduled to present competing visions for the future of farming. Backstage before her presentation, Madison encountered Harrison, a tall man with cold eyes and a predatory smile. "Ms. Hayes," he greeted her with mock courtesy, "I look forward to your idealistic speech about feeding the world." The adults in the room, however, understand that progress requires profit. "And funny," Madison replied calmly. "I would have thought adults understood that you can't eat money." The exchange set the tone for what followed. Harrison's presentation portrayed Atlas as the next evolution in agricultural technology, sleek, efficient, and profitable. He spoke of smart farming and agricultural optimization, using corporate doublespeak to mask the system's exploitative nature. When Madison took the stage, she abandoned her prepared remarks. Instead, she did something unprecedented at such a formal gathering. She invited farmers from the audience to join her on stage. "Mr. Blackstone speaks of evolution," she began, as a dozen farmers from different countries stood beside her. "Let's ask the people who actually grow our food what they think." One by one, the farmers shared their experiences. A rice grower from Vietnam explained how the Commons technologies had freed his family from generations of debt. A wheat farmer from Ukraine described surviving droughts that would have destroyed traditional crops. A coffee cultivator from Colombia revealed how open-source pest management had saved her entire region's harvest. "Atlas promises efficiency," Madison continued after the farmers spoke, "but efficiency for whom? Their system would turn these independent farmers into digital sharecroppers, forever dependent on corporate algorithms and patented seeds." She then unveiled something that changed the entire conversation, a detailed analysis showing that Atlas's technologies were largely derived from research originally conducted by common scientists, research that had been deliberately published, open source, to prevent exactly this kind of appropriation. "They're not innovating," Madison declared. "They're stealing from the public domain and trying to sell it back to us with chains attached." The revelation sparked immediate controversy. Several investors in the audience began furiously messaging on their devices. Harrison's confident demeanor cracked as he realized the implications of Madison's accusation. In the days following the summit, Atlas's coalition began to fracture. 3 major agricultural companies withdrew their support, citing concerns about legal liability. Investment funds demanded additional due diligence. The timeline Harrison had promised became increasingly unrealistic, But the decisive blow came from an unexpected source. Victoria Blackwood, working with the Commons legal team, filed a whistleblower complaint with international regulatory bodies. Her inside knowledge of Atlas's development process, combined with documentation she'd secretly retained, provided irrefutable evidence of the project's predatory nature. The ensuing investigation revealed that Atlas had violated numerous international agreements on genetic resources and intellectual property.
Land of Hodala for Plua. Lausasa, Kisasi, the Hank Ackerel free.
At the Montana campus, Madison found herself surrounded by the extended family she'd built over 3 years of struggle. Researchers, farmers, activists, and even former adversaries like Victoria Blackwood mingled freely, united by their shared commitment to agricultural justice. James called for attention, raising a glass of locally produced wine, to Madison Hayes, who proved that a farmer's daughter could change the world. The crowd cheered, but Madison quickly redirected the tribute. To all of us, she countered. To everyone who believed that feeding humanity was more important than feeding profits. To those who understood that true innovation serves everyone, not just shareholders. Later that evening, as the celebration continued, Madison and James watched the sunset from the ranch's observation deck. Below them, the experimental fields glowed with sustainable lighting powered by solar arrays, another Commons innovation, now being deployed worldwide. "You've accomplished something remarkable," James said softly. "Not just the technologies or the organization, but the movement. You've changed how people think about progress itself." Madison leaned against the railing, contemplating his words. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone to that auction, if you hadn't revealed yourself." "You would have found another way," James replied with certainty. "The auction was just a catalyst. Your real power was never in the Whitmore name or fortune. It was in your vision of what agriculture could be." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the stars emerge. Finally, James spoke. "Again, I've been thinking about your father lately, how proud he would be." Madison felt tears threaten but held them back. He died protecting a small farm that seemed worthless to everyone else. "He died protecting a principle," James corrected. "The same principle you've now spread worldwide, that land belongs to those who nurture it, not those who exploit it." The next morning brought news that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. The United Nations had passed a resolution declaring access to agricultural innovation a fundamental human right. The Commons model would be protected under international law, ensuring that no corporation could again attempt to monopolize the basic technologies of food production. Madison stood in the control room of the newly operational food security network, watching as data streams flowed in from thousands of monitoring stations. Predictive algorithms identified potential crop failures months in advance, allowing for preventive measures. Supply chain optimizations reduced food waste by 60%. Smart distribution systems ensured that surplus from one region could quickly reach areas of scarcity. Dr. Martinez joined her, having returned from Bangladesh to officially accept the CEO position. "You know what's remarkable," she said, studying the displays. "We're not just preventing famines anymore, we're creating abundance." That was always the goal, Madison replied. Grandfather taught me that true wealth isn't about having more and than you need. It's about ensuring everyone has enough. As if summoned by her words, James appeared in the doorway. Despite his age, he moved with purpose, carrying a small wooden box. "I have something for you," he announced, approaching Madison. "Something I've been saving for the right moment." Inside the box was an antique compass, its brass surface worn smooth by generations of handling. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," James explained. "He carried it when he homesteaded the original Whitmore land in 1847. It's guided our family through good times and bad, always pointing toward true north." Madison accepted the compass reverently, understanding its symbolism. "And now you think I need it?" "No," James smiled. "I think you've become it. For millions of people worldwide, you're the one pointing toward true north." The weight of his words settled over Madison as she realized the transition was complete. She was no longer just the inheritor of the Whitmore legacy. She had transformed it into something far greater. The humiliation at the auction house had been the chrysalis from which she emerged, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of what humanity could achieve when it prioritized collective well-being over individual gain. That afternoon, Madison recorded a message that would be broadcast to Commons members worldwide. Standing in the Heritage Museum, surrounded by artifacts representing generations of agricultural innovation, she spoke from the heart. 3 years ago, I stood in an auction house and watched wealthy collectors bid on a piece of farming history they saw as a mere decoration. Today, that same piece of equipment operates in our testing fields, helping develop technologies that feed millions. This transformation, from symbol of exclusivity to tool of inclusivity, represents everything we've achieved together. She held up the compass James had given her. We've proven that another way is possible, that cooperation can triumph over competition, that open hands achieve more than closed fists. But our work is far from over. As long as anyone, anywhere goes hungry while others waste food, we have not succeeded. As long as farmers bear the risks while corporations reap the profits, we have not finished. As long as innovation serves the few rather than the many, we must continue. The message resonated globally, translated into dozens of languages, and shared across every platform. It became known as the Compass Declaration, a manifesto for a new era of agricultural ethics. In the months that followed, the Commons expanded beyond anyone's initial vision. Educational programs reached millions of students, research facilities opened on every continent. The Food Security Network prevented 3 potential famines before they could begin. And through it all, Madison remained the guiding force, no longer just a CEO or chair, but a global ambassador for agricultural justice. The transformation from humiliated farmer's daughter to worldwide leader was complete. But for Madison, the most important change was internal. She had learned that true power didn't come from wealth or status, but from purpose aligned with action. The girl who had stood frozen in that auction house, enduring mockery from society's elite, had become the woman who made those same elites irrelevant in the quest to feed humanity. As she walked through the Montana campus, now a place of pilgrimage for agricultural innovators worldwide, Madison often thought of her father's small farm in Iowa. It still operated, now as a demonstration site showing how traditional family farms could thrive using commons technologies. The boots he had given her, which had drawn such derision in Manhattan, were now displayed in the Smithsonian as a symbol of agricultural revolution. The revolution wasn't just about technology or economics. It was about values. It proved that humanity's greatest achievements came not from competition, but collaboration, not from hoarding, but sharing, not from exploiting, but nurturing. And at its heart stood Madison Hayes, the farmer's daughter who had inherited not just an empire, but the responsibility to transform how the world understood progress itself. 20 years had passed since Madison Hayes stood humiliated in that Manhattan auction house, and the world had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The Agricultural Innovation Commons now operated research centers in 127 countries, while the Global Food Security Network had eliminated famine from regions that had suffered for centuries. Madison, now 47, stood at the edge of the original Whitmore Ranch in Montana, watching her 16-year-old daughter Emma conduct soil tests with technology that hadn't existed when she was that age. "Mom, the microbial count is off the charts," Emma called out, her enthusiasm echoing Madison's own passion from decades earlier. "The regenerative techniques are working even better than the models predicted." Madison smiled, remembering when these same fields had been experimental plots. Now they served as living proof that sustainable agriculture could heal damaged ecosystems while producing abundant food. Emma represented the first generation born into a world where food security was considered a fundamental right, not a privilege. The sound of an approaching helicopter drew their attention skyward. Madison recognized the UN markings. They were arriving for James Whitmore's memorial service. Her grandfather had passed peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks ago at age 108, leaving behind a legacy that had reshaped human civilization. As the helicopter landed, Madison saw familiar faces emerge. Dr. Elena Martinez, still leading the Commons with remarkable energy despite her advancing years. Thomas Chen, whose engineering innovations had revolutionized farming equipment, and surprisingly, Victoria Blackwood, now one of the Commons' most passionate advocates and a close family friend. "He planned even this," Victoria said, as she embraced Madison. James left instructions that his memorial should launch the next phase of the Commons' evolution. Inside the ranch's grand hall, now expanded to accommodate global gatherings, hundreds of people assembled. They represented every continent, every agricultural tradition, and every level of society, from subsistence farmers to heads of state. Behind the podium hung a massive portrait of James Whitmore, but not the corporate titan of his early years. Instead, it showed him in worn work clothes, hands dirty from planting, the way he'd spent his final decades. Madison took the podium, her presence commanding the same respect her grandfather once had. 20 years ago, James Whitmore did something unprecedented for a billionaire. He used his death as a tool for rebirth, not his own, but the world's. She pressed a button, and holographic displays filled the air above the audience. Today, 8 billion people have access to sufficient food. Agricultural biodiversity has increased by 300%. Small farmers own 70% of productive land, reversing a century of corporate consolidation. These aren't just statistics. Their lives changed, communities preserved, ecosystems restored. The displays shifted to show a new initiative, Project Phoenix, James's final vision for transforming abandoned urban areas into vertical farming complexes powered by fusion energy. Grandfather believed we'd only scratched the surface of what's possible, Madison continued. Project Phoenix will bring food production into cities, eliminating transportation waste while creating millions of jobs. The technology exists. The funding is secured through the Whitmore Trust. All we need is the will to act. As she spoke, Madison noticed Emma in the audience, sitting beside a group of young activists from the Commons Youth Corps. Her daughter's generation had never known a world where food was weaponized, where farmers were indentured to corporations, where hunger was accepted as inevitable. They took for granted the freedoms that Madison and James had fought to establish. After the formal presentation, Madison found herself in James's study, surrounded by the core team that had built the Commons. Elena, now CEO Emeritus, poured glasses of wine produced from the ranch's own vineyards. "He left something for each of us," Eleanor announced, distributing sealed envelopes with James's distinctive handwriting. Madison's read simply, "For my granddaughter, who exceeded every hope I dared to have." Inside, she found a letter and a small key. "Dearest Madison, by now you've unveiled Project Phoenix, and probably wonder if I've left you yet another impossible task. I haven't. Phoenix is already fully funded and planned. It just needed the right moment for launch. The key opens a safety deposit box in Zurich. Inside, you'll find documents I've kept secret, even from you. They detail a parallel project I've been developing with a select team, the Prometheus Initiative. While the Commons fed the world, Prometheus has been quietly acquiring controlling interests in major energy companies. As of my death, we own enough shares to force a transition to renewable energy across the sector. The same strategy that transformed agriculture can now be applied to energy, but this time you won't be alone. Emma is remarkable. I've watched her grow with the same pride I felt watching you. She understands systems thinking in ways that took us decades to learn. When she's ready, Prometheus will be her revolution to lead. The boy who once dreamed of helping farmers became a man who helped feed the world. The man who helped feed the world became a grandfather who watched his granddaughter make that world sustainable. And now I pass the torch one final time. Remember what I told you that day at the auction. True wealth isn't in having more than you need, but in ensuring everyone has enough. You've lived that truth every day since. With eternal love and pride, James." Madison looked up from the letter to find the others reading their own messages with tears and smiles. Each had received not just personal words, but strategic guidance for their areas of expertise. Even in death, James Whitmore was coordinating a revolution. "He never stopped planning," Thomas Chen said softly. "I've got blueprints here for fusion-powered desalination plants that could transform desert agriculture." Victoria held up technical specifications. "Mine details how to use blockchain technology to create truly democratic food distribution systems. No middlemen, no corporate control." As they shared their letters, Madison realized James had orchestrated one final masterstroke. Each document contained a piece of a larger puzzle that, when combined, would launch the next phase of human development. The following months saw the Commons enter its most ambitious phase yet. Project Phoenix began transforming abandoned factories and warehouses into vertical farms that could feed entire neighborhoods. The Prometheus Initiative, led by Madison with Emma as apprentice, started the delicate process of restructuring global energy markets. The pushback was fierce, but different. from 20 years ago. This time, the opposition came not from entrenched corporations, most had either adapted or collapsed, but from nations still clinging to fossil fuel economies. Madison found herself negotiating with world leaders, using the same combination of data, moral authority, and strategic pressure that had worked in agriculture. One particularly tense meeting with oil-producing nations ended when Madison played a recording of James from years earlier. They'll threaten economic collapse, just as agricultural giants once threatened famine. But remember, people adapt to new realities faster than institutions admit. Show them a better way, and they'll take it. Emma proved instrumental in these efforts, bringing a perspective that bridged generations. She'd grown up with sustainable technology and couldn't comprehend why anyone would resist obvious improvements. Her presentations to youth delegates at climate summits went viral, earning her the nickname the Energy Revolutionary. On the 5th anniversary of James's passing, the Commons achieved something unprecedented. Global food security officially reached 100%. The UN declared it humanity's greatest achievement, comparable to eradicating smallpox or landing on the moon. The celebration at the Montana ranch drew thousands. The experimental fields where Madison had first discovered her grandfather's true mission now hosted pavilions showcasing agricultural innovations from every culture. Traditional farming wisdom merged with cutting-edge technology in displays that would have seemed like science fiction just decades earlier. Madison gave the keynote address from the same podium where she'd announced Project Phoenix. Behind her stood Emma, now 21, and already leading initiatives that Madison could barely comprehend. The torch was passing again, just as James had foreseen. 25 years ago, Madison began, I stood in an auction house, mocked for my farmer's boots, and derided for daring to bid on a piece of history. The people in that room saw agriculture as an investment opportunity, farmers as expendable resources, and technology as a means for profit. She gestured to the crowd spread across the ranch. Today, those same boots are in the Smithsonian. The tractor I tried to buy powers our heritage education program, and the man they thought dead has helped feed the world from beyond the grave. The audience laughed and applauded, but Madison raised her hand for silence. But this isn't just about vindication or success. It's about proving that humanity's greatest achievements come not from competition, but collaboration, not from hoarding, but sharing. She turned to Emma. My grandfather taught me that true wealth meant ensuring everyone had enough. He taught that to my daughter. Now she's teaching it to the world in ways I never imagined. Emma stepped forward, confident in a way Madison had never been at that age. My generation doesn't see food security as an achievement to celebrate, she declared. We see it as a foundation to build upon. While you ensured everyone could eat, we'll ensure everyone can thrive. The crowd erupted in cheers as Emma outlined her vision, integrating food, energy, and information systems into a global network that would optimize resource distribution in real time. It was ambitious beyond anything the Commons had attempted, but Madison recognized the same fire that had driven her and James. Later that evening, as the celebration continued, Madison found herself alone in James's study. The portrait on the wall now included 3 generations: James in his worn work clothes, Madison in her legendary boots, and Emma in the lab coat she'd earned through her own research. Victoria Blackwood joined her, looking at the portrait with undisguised emotion. You know, I spent years trying to destroy what James built. Now I can't imagine a world without it. He never saw you as an enemy, Madison replied. Just someone who hadn't yet understood what was possible. Victoria nodded. The day I decided to betray Project Atlas, I thought I was sacrificing my career for principle. Instead, I found a purpose greater than any career could offer. She paused. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gone to that auction? Madison considered the question. Grandfather would have found another way to reveal himself. The revolution was inevitable. The auction just determined its shape. A knock interrupted them. Emma entered with a tablet displaying urgent news. The last holdout nation had agreed to join the Prometheus Initiative. The global transition to renewable energy was now unstoppable. Grandfather's final domino, Emma said with satisfaction. He predicted it would take exactly 5 years from his death. Madison marveled at James's foresight. Even from beyond the grave, his strategic planning continued to unfold with clockwork precision. As midnight approached, Madison stood on the ranch's observation deck, where she and James had shared so many conversations. Emma joined her, along with the extended family of revolutionaries they'd assembled over decades. "What's next?" Emma asked, echoing a question Madison had once posed to James. "Whatever you decide," Madison replied. "The Commons was my revolution. Prometheus is yours. But remember what your great-grandfather taught us. Revolutions aren't about tearing down. They're about building up." Emma nodded, her eyes reflecting the same determination Madison had seen in James. "Then let's build something unprecedented, not just sustainable systems, but regenerative ones, not just feeding the world, but healing it." Below them, the fields glowed with sustainable lighting, powered by the same fusion technology they were now deploying globally. Automated systems tended crops that would have seemed impossible in Madison's youth, and in the distance, the lights of the vertical farms in nearby cities created new constellations on the horizon. The auction house humiliation that had sparked this journey seemed impossibly distant now, not just in time, but in relevance. The society that had mocked Madison's boots and farming background had been fundamentally transformed. The elite who had hoarded resources now competed to contribute to the commons. The corporations that had exploited farmers now operated under charters that prioritized sustainability over profit. As the gathering moved inside to escape the night chill, Madison remained on the deck, feeling the weight of history and the lightness of hope. A shooting star streaked across the Montana sky, or perhaps it was one of the satellites that now monitored global crop health and predicted weather patterns with unprecedented accuracy. In the quiet moment, she heard James's voice in her memory. True power isn't in controlling resources, but in liberating them, not in accumulating wealth, but in distributing opportunity. 25 years after that fateful auction, Madison Hayes had proven these words true on a global scale. The farmer's daughter who had been laughed out of Manhattan had not only inherited an empire, but transformed it into a movement that reshaped human civilization. As she turned to rejoin the celebration, Madison caught her reflection in the window. She saw not just herself, but the generations before and after. James with his strategic brilliance, her father with his unwavering principles, and Emma with her boundless vision for the future. The Whitmore legacy had evolved from industrial empire to agricultural revolution to global transformation, And as Emma began planning the next phase, integrating food, energy, and information systems into what she called the Humanity Network, Madison knew the journey that began with humiliation in an auction house would continue long after she was gone. The true inheritance wasn't wealth or power, but the understanding that one person's stand against injustice could catalyze changes that echoed through generations. The boots that had once marked her as an outsider were now symbols of a revolution that had fed the world and would continue to nurture humanity's highest aspirations. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of possibility, Madison Hayes smiled. The future her grandfather had envisioned was no longer a dream, but a reality, and it was just the beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.